20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Jules Verne's most fantastic and beloved adventure. Join us now for a quick trip under the waves into a world of the fabulous. If you like this sort of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment if you would. On with the tale. Chapter 7. The Mediterranean in 48 Hours. The Mediterranean, the blue sea par excellence, the great sea of the Hebrews, the sea of the Greeks, the mare nostrum of the Romans, bordered by orange trees, aloes, cacti, and sea pines, embalmed with the perfume of the myrtle, surrounded by rude mountains, saturated with pure and transparent air, but incessantly worked by underground fires, a perfect battlefield in which Neptune and Pluto still dispute the empire of the world. It is upon these banks, and on these waters, says Michelet, that man is renewed in one of the most powerful climates of the globe. But, beautiful as it was, I could only take a rapid glance at the basin whose superficial area is 2 million of square yards. Even Captain Nemo's knowledge was lost to me, for this puzzling person did not appear once during our passage at full speed. I estimated the course which the Nautilus took out of the waves of the sea at about 600 leagues, and it was accomplished in 48 hours. Starting on the morning of February 16th from the shores of Greece, we had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar by sunrise on the 18th. It was plain to me that this Mediterranean, enclosed in the midst of those countries which he wished to avoid, was distasteful to Captain Nemo. Those waves and those breezes brought back too many remembrances, if not too many regrets. Here he had no longer that independence, that liberty of gait, which he had when in the open seas, and his Nautilus felt itself cramped between the close shores of Africa and Europe. Our speed was now 25 miles an hour. It may be well understood that Ned Land, to his great disgust, was obliged to renounce his intended flight. He could not launch the pinnace, going at the rate of 12 or 13 yards every second. To quit the Nautilus under such conditions would be as bad as jumping from a train going at full speed, an imprudent thing, to say the least of it. Besides, our vessel only mounted to the surface of the waves at night to renew its stock of air. It was steered entirely by the compass and the log. I saw no more of the interior of this Mediterranean than a traveler by express train perceives of the landscape which flies before his eyes. That is to say, the distant horizon, and not the nearer objects which pass like a flash of lightning. In the midst of the mass of waters brightly lit up by the electric light, gilded some of those lampreys, more than a yard long, common to almost every climate. Some of the oxyrinci, a kind of ray 5 feet broad, with white belly and gray spotted back, spread out like a shawl carried along by the current. A few Melander sharks, 12 feet long, endowed with wonderful fineness of scent, appeared like blue shadows. Some dorades of the shark kind, some of which measured 7 feet and a half, showed themselves in their dress of blue and silver, encircled by small bands which struck sharply against the somber tints of their fins. A fish consecrated to Venus, the eyes of which are encased in a socket of gold, a precious species, friend of all waters, fresh or salt, an inhabitant of rivers, lakes, and oceans, living in all climates, and bearing all temperatures, a race belonging to the geological era of the earth, and which has preserved all the beauty of its first days. They swam in a triangle, like certain flocks of birds, whose rapidity they equaled, and of which the ancients used to say that they understood geometry and strategy. But still they do not escape the pursuit of the provincials, who esteem them as highly as the inhabitants of the Propontis and of Italy used to do. And these precious, foolhardy creatures perish by millions in the nets of Marseilles. With regard to the species of fish common to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the giddy speed of the Nautilus prevented me from observing them with any degree of accuracy. As to marine animals, I thought in passing the entrance of the Adriatic that I saw 2 or 3 cachalots, furnished with one dorsal fin of the genus Physeter, some dolphins of the genus Globicephala, peculiar to the Mediterranean, the back part of the head being marked like a zebra with small lines, also a dozen of seals with white bellies and black hair, known by the name of monks, and which really have the air of a Dominican. They're about 3 yards in length. As to zoophytes, for some instants I was able to admire a beautiful orange Gallialara, which had fastened itself to the port panel. It held on by a long filament and was divided into an infinity of branches, terminated by the finest lace which would ever have been woven by the rivals of Arachne herself. We were then passing between Sicily and the coast of Tunis. In the narrow space between Cape Bon and the Straits of Messina, the bottom of the sea rose almost suddenly. There was a perfect bank, on which there was not more than 9 fathoms of water, while on either side the depth was 90 fathoms. The Nautilus had to maneuver very carefully so as not to strike against this submarine barrier. I showed Conseil on the map of the Mediterranean the spot occupied by this reef. "But if you please, sir," observed Conseil, "it is like a real isthmus, joining Europe to Africa." "Yes, my boy. It forms a perfect bar to the Straits of Libya, and the soundings of Smith have proved that in former times the continents between Cape Boko and Cape Farina were joined." "I can well believe it." "I will add," I continued, "that a similar barrier exists between Gibraltar and Ceuta, which in geologic times formed the entire Mediterranean." "What if some volcanic burst should one day raise these 2 barriers above the waves?" "It is not probable, Conseil." "Well, but allow me to finish, please, sir. If this phenomenon should take place, it will be troublesome for Monsieur Lesseps, who has taken so much pains to pierce the isthmus." "I agree with you, but I repeat, Conseil, this phenomenon will never happen. The violence of subterranean force is ever diminishing. Volcanoes, so plentiful in the first days of the world, are being extinguished by degrees. The internal heat is weakened. The temperature of the lower strata of the globe is lowered by a perceptible quantity every century, to the detriment of our globe, for its heat is its life." "But the sun?" "The sun is not sufficient, Conseil. Can it give heat to a dead body?" "Not that I know of." "Well, my friend, this earth will one day be that cold corpse. It will become uninhabitable and uninhabited, like the moon, which has long since lost all its vital heat." "In how many centuries?" "In some hundreds of thousands of years, my boy." "Then we shall have time to finish our journey. That is, if Ned Land does not interfere with it." And Conseil, reassured, returned to the study of the bank, which the Nautilus was skirting at a moderate speed. There, beneath the rocky and volcanic bottom, lay outspread a living floor of sponges and reddish cytipes, which emitted a slight phosphorescent light, commonly known by the name of sea cucumbers, and walking comatulae more than a yard long, the purple of which completely colored the water around. The Nautilus, having now passed the high bank of the Libyan Straits, returned to the deep waters and its accustomed speed. From that time on, no more mollusks, no more articulates, no more zoophytes, barely a few large fish passing like shadows. During the night of February 16th and 17th, we had entered the second Mediterranean basin, the greatest depth of which was 1,450 fathoms. The Nautilus, by the action of its crew, slid down the inclined planes and buried itself in the lowest depths of the sea. On February 18th, about 3 o'clock in the morning, we were at the entrance of the Straits of Gibraltar. There once existed 2 currents, an upper one, long since recognized, which conveys the waters of the ocean into the basin of the Mediterranean, and a lower counter-current, which reasoning has now shown to exist. Indeed, the volume of water in the Mediterranean, incessantly added to by the waves of the Atlantic and by rivers falling into it, would each year raise the level of the sea, for its evaporation is not sufficient to restore the equilibrium. As it is not so, we must necessarily admit the existence of an undercurrent which empties into the basin of the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar, the surplus waters of the Mediterranean. A fact indeed, and it was this countercurrent by which the Nautilus profited. It advanced rapidly by the narrow pass. For one instant I caught a glimpse of the beautiful ruins of the Temple of Hercules, buried in the ground, according to Pliny, and with the low island which supports it. And a few minutes later, we were floating on the Atlantic. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Vigo Bay. The Atlantic, a vast sheet of water whose superficial area covers 25 millions of square miles, the length of which is 9,000 miles with a mean breadth of 2,700, an ocean whose parallel winding shores embrace an immense circumference, watered by the largest rivers of the world, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco, the Niger, the Senegal, the Elbe, the Loire, and the Rhine, which carry water from the most civilized as well as from the most savage countries. Magnificent field of water, incessantly plowed by vessels of every nation, sheltered by the flags of every nation, and which terminates in those two terrible points so dreaded by mariners, Cape Horn and the Cape of Tempests. The Nautilus was piercing the water with its sharp spur after having accomplished nearly 10,000 leagues in 3 months and a half, a distance greater than the great circle of the earth. Where were we going now, and what was reserved for the future? The Nautilus, leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, had gone far out. It returned to the surface of the waves, and our daily walks to the platform were restored to us. I mounted at once, accompanied by Ned Land and Conseil. At a distance of about 12 miles, Cape St. Vincent was dimly to be seen, forming the southwestern point of the Spanish peninsula. A strong southerly gale was blowing. The sea was swollen and billowy. It made the Nautilus rock violently. It was almost impossible to keep one's foot on the platform, which the heavy rolls of the sea bent over every instant, so we descended after inhaling some mouthfuls of fresh air. I returned to my room, Conseil to his cabin, but the Canadian, with a preoccupied air, followed me. Our rapid passage across the Mediterranean had not allowed him to put his project into execution, and he could not help showing his disappointment. When the door of my room was shut, he sat down and looked at me silently. "Friend Ned," said I understand you, but you cannot reproach yourself. To have attempted to leave the Nautilus under the circumstances would have been folly." Ned Land did not answer. His compressed lips and frowning brow showed with him the violent possession this fixed idea had taken of his mind. "Let us see," I continued. "We need not despair yet. We are going up the coast of Portugal again. France and England are not far off, where we can easily find refuge. Now if the Nautilus, on leaving the Straits of Gibraltar, had gone to the south, if it had carried us towards regions where there were no continents, I should share your uneasiness, but we know now that Captain Nemo does not fly from civilized seas, and in some days I think you can act with security." Ned Land still looked at me fixedly. At length his fixed lips parted, and he said, "It is for tonight." I drew myself up suddenly. I was, I admit, little prepared for this communication. I wanted to answer the Canadian, but words would not come. "We agreed to wait for an opportunity," continued Ned Land, "and the opportunity has arrived. This night we shall be but a few miles from the Spanish coast. It is cloudy, the wind blows freely. I have your word, Monsieur Aronnax, and I rely upon you." As I was silent, the Canadian approached me. "Tonight, at 9 o'clock, said he. "I have warned Conseil. At that moment, Captain Nemo will be shut up in his room, probably in bed. Neither the engineers nor the ship's crew can see us. Conseil and I will gain the central staircase, and you, Monsieur Aronnax, will remain in the library 2 steps from us, waiting my signal. The oars, the mast, and the sail are in the canoe. I have even succeeded in getting some provisions. I have procured an English wrench to unfasten the bolts which attach it to the shell of the Nautilus. So all is ready till tonight." The sea is bad. That I allow, replied the Canadian. But we must risk that. Liberty is worth paying for. Besides, the boat is strong, and a few miles with a fair wind to carry us is no great thing. Who knows but by tomorrow we may be 100 leagues away. Let circumstances only favor us, and by 10 or 11 o'clock we shall have landed on some spot of terra firma, alive or dead. But adieu now. Till tonight. With these words the Canadian withdrew, leaving me almost dumb. I had imagined that, the chance gone, I should have time to reflect and discuss the matter. My obstinate companion had given me no time, and after all, what could I have said to him? Ned Land was perfectly right. There was almost the opportunity to profit by. Could I retract my word? Take upon myself the responsibility of compromising the future of my companions? Tomorrow Captain Nemo might take us far from all land. At that moment a rather loud hissing noise told me that the reservoirs were filling, and the Nautilus was sinking under the waves of the Atlantic. A sad day I passed, between the desire of regaining my liberty of action and of abandoning the wonderful Nautilus and leaving my submarine studies incomplete. What dreadful hours I passed thus, sometimes seeing myself and companion safely landed, sometimes wishing, in spite of my reason, that some unforeseen circumstance would prevent the realization of Ned Land's project. Twice I went to the saloon. I wished to consult the compass. I wished to see if the direction the Nautilus was taking was bringing us nearer or taking us farther from the coast. But no, the Nautilus kept in Portuguese waters. I must therefore take my part and prepare for flight. My luggage was not heavy. My notes, nothing more. As to Captain Nemo, I asked myself what he would think of our escape, what trouble, what wrong it might cause him, and what he might do in case of its discovery or failure. Certainly I had no cause to complain of him. On the contrary, never was hospitality freer than his. In leaving him, I could not be taxed with ingratitude. No oath bound us to him. It was on the strength of circumstances he relied, and not upon our word to fix us forever. I had not seen the captain since our visit to the island of Santorin. Would chance bring me to his presence before our departure? I wished it, and I feared it at the same time. I listened if I could hear him walking through the room contiguous to mine. No sound reached my ear. I felt an unbearable uneasiness. This day of waiting seemed eternal. Hours struck too slowly to keep pace with my impatience. My dinner was served in my room as usual. I ate but little. I was too preoccupied. I left the table at 7 o'clock. 120 minutes, I counted them, still separated me from the moment in which I was to join Ned Land. My agitation redoubled. My pulse beat violently. I could not remain quiet. I went and came, hoping to calm my troubled spirit by constant movement. The idea of failure in our bold enterprise was the least painful of my anxieties, but the thought of seeing our project discovered before leaving the Nautilus, of being brought before Captain Nemo irritated, or what was worse, saddened at my desertion, made my heart beat. I wanted to see the saloon for the last time. I descended the stairs and arrived in the museum where I had passed so many useful and agreeable hours. I looked at all its riches, all its treasures, like a man on the eve of an eternal exile who was leaving never to return. These wonders of nature, these masterpieces of art, among which for so many days my life had been concentrated, I was going to abandon them forever. I should like to have taken a last look through the windows of the saloon into the waters of the Atlantic, but the panels were hermetically closed, and a cloak of steel separated me from that ocean which I had not yet explored. In passing through the saloon, I came near the door let into the angle which opened into the captain's room. To my great surprise, this door was ajar. I drew back involuntarily. If Captain Nemo should be in his room, he could see me. But hearing no sound, I drew nearer. The room was deserted. I pushed open the door and took some steps forward, still the same monk-like severity of aspect. Suddenly the clock struck 8. The first beat of the hammer on the bell awoke me from my dreams. I trembled as if an invisible eye had plunged into my most secret thoughts, and I hurried from the room. There my eye fell upon the compass. Our course was still north. The log indicated moderate speed, the manometer a depth of about 60 feet. I returned to my room, clothed myself warmly. Sea boots, an otterskin cap, a great coat of byssus lined with sealskin. I was ready. I was waiting. The vibration of the screw alone broke the deep silence which reigned on board. I listened attentively. Would no loud voice suddenly inform me that Ned Land had been surprised with his projected flight? A mortal dread hung over me, and I vainly tried to regain my accustomed coolness. At a few minutes to 9, I put my ear to the captain's door. No noise. I left my room and returned to the saloon, which was half in obscurity, but deserted. I opened the door communicating with the library. The same insufficient light, the same solitude. I placed myself near the door leading to the central staircase, and there waited for Ned Land's signal. At that moment the trembling of the screws sensibly diminished. Then it stopped entirely. The silence was now only disturbed by the beatings of my own heart. Suddenly a slight shock was felt, and I knew that the Nautilus had stopped at the bottom of the ocean. My uneasiness increased. The Canadian signal did not come. I felt inclined to join Ned Land and beg of him to put off his attempt. I felt that we were not sailing under our usual conditions. At this moment the door of the large saloon opened, and Captain Nemo appeared. He saw me, and without further preamble began in an amiable tone of voice. "Ah, sir, I have been looking for you. Do you know the history of Spain?" Now, one might know the history of one's own country by heart, but in the condition I was at the time, with troubled mind and head quite lost, I could not have said a word of it. "Well," continued Captain Nemo, "you heard my question. Do you know the history of Spain?" "Very slightly," I answered. "Well, here are learned men having to learn," said the captain. "Come, sit down, and I will tell you a curious episode in this history. Sir, listen well," said he. "This history will interest you on one side, for it will answer a question which doubtless you have not been able to solve." "I listen, Captain," said I, not knowing what my interlocutor was driving at, and asking myself if this incident was bearing on our projected flight. "Sir, if you have no objection, we will go back to 1702. You cannot be ignorant that your king, Louis XIV, thinking that the gesture of a potentate was sufficient to bring the Pyrenees under his yoke, had imposed the Duke of Anjou, his grandson, on the Spaniards. This prince reigned more or less badly under the name of Philip V, and had a strong party against him abroad. Indeed, the preceding year the royal houses of Holland, Austria, and England had concluded a treaty of alliance at The Hague, with the intention of plucking the crown of Spain from the head of Philip V, and placing it on that of an archduke, to whom they prematurely gave the title of Charles III. Spain must resist this coalition, but she was almost entirely unprovided with either soldiers or sailors. However, money would not fail them, provided that their galleons, laden with gold and silver from America, once entered their ports. At about the end of 1702, they expected a rich convoy which France was escorting with a fleet of 23 vessels, commanded by Admiral Chateau Renaud, for the ships of the coalition were already beating the Atlantic. This convoy was to go to Cadiz, but the admiral, hearing that an English fleet was cruising in those waters, resolved to make for a French port. The Spanish commanders of the convoy objected to this decision. They wanted to be taken to a Spanish port, and if not to Cadiz, into Vigo Bay, situated on the northwest coast of Spain, and which was not blocked. Admiral Chateau Renaud had the rashness to obey this injunction, and the galleons entered Vigo Bay. Unfortunately, it formed an open road which could not be defended in any way. They must therefore hasten to unload the galleons before the arrival of the combined fleet, and the time would not have failed them had not a miserable question of rivalry suddenly arisen. "You are following the chain of events?" asked Captain Nemo. "Perfectly," said I, not knowing the end proposed by this historical lesson. "I will continue. This is what passed. The merchants of Cadiz had the privilege by which they had the right of receiving all merchandise coming from the West Indies. Now, to disembark these ingots at the port of Vigo was depriving them of their rights. They complained at Madrid and obtained the consent of the weak-minded Philip that the convoy, without discharging its cargo, should remain sequestered at the roads of Vigo until the enemy had disappeared. But while coming to this decision on October 22nd, 1702, the English vessels arrived in Vigo Bay, when Admiral Chateau Renaud, in spite of inferior forces, fought bravely. But seeing that the treasure must fall into the enemy's hands, he burned and scuttled every galleon which went to the bottom with their immense riches." Captain Nemo stopped. I admit I could not see yet why this history should interest me. "Well?" "Well, Monsieur Aronnax," replied Captain Nemo, "we are in that Vigo Bay, and it rests with yourself whether you will penetrate its mysteries." The captain rose, telling me to follow him. I had had time to recover. I obeyed. The saloon was dark, but through the transparent glass the waves were sparkling. I looked. For half a mile around the Nautilus the water seemed bathed in electric light. The sandy bottom was clean and bright. Some of the ship's crew, in their diving dresses, were clearing away half-rotten barrels and empty cases from the midst of the blackened wrecks. From these cases and from these barrels escaped ingots of gold and silver, cascades of piastres and jewels. The sand was heaped up with them. Laden with their precious booty, the men returned to the Nautilus, disposed of their burden, and went back to this inexhaustible fishery of gold and silver. I understood now. This was the scene of the Battle of October 22nd, 1702. Here, on this very spot, the galleons laden for the Spanish government had sunk. Here Captain Nemo came, according to his wants, to pack up those millions with which he burdened the Nautilus. It was for him and him alone America had given up her precious metals. He was heir direct, without anyone to share in those treasures torn from the Incas and from the conquered of Ferdinand Cortez. "Did you know, sir," he asked, smiling, "that the sea contained such riches?" "I knew," I answered, "that they value money held in suspension in these waters in 2 millions. "Doubtless, but to extract this money the expense would be greater than the profit. Here, on the contrary, I have but to pick up what man has lost, and not only in Vigo Bay, but in 1,000 other ports where shipwrecks have happened, and which are marked on my submarine map. Can you understand now the source of the millions I am worth?" "I understand, Captain, but allow me to tell you that in exploring Vigo Bay, you have only been beforehand with a rival society." "And which?" "A society which has received from the Spanish government the privilege of seeking those buried galleons. The shareholders are led on by the allurement of enormous bounty, for they value these rich shipwrecks at 500 millions. 500 millions they were," answered Captain Nemo, "but they are no longer." "Just so," said I, "and a warning to those shareholders would be an act of charity. But who knows if it would be well received? What gamblers usually regret above all is less the loss of their money than of their foolish hopes. After all, I pity them less than the thousands of unfortunates to whom so much riches well distributed would have been profitable, while for them they will be forever barren." I had no sooner expressed this regret than I felt that it must have wounded Captain Nemo. "Barren!" he exclaimed with animation. "Do you think then, sir, that these riches are lost because I gather them? Is it for myself alone, according to your idea, that I take the trouble to collect these treasures? Who told you that I did not make a good use of it? Do you think I am ignorant that there are suffering beings and oppressed races on this earth, miserable creatures to console, victims to avenge? Do you not understand? Captain Nemo stopped at these last words, regretting perhaps that he had spoken so much. But I had guessed that whatever the motive which had forced him to seek independence under the sea, it had left him still a man, that his heart still beat for the sufferings of humanity, and that his immense charity was for oppressed races as well as individuals. And I then understood for whom those millions were destined which were forwarded by Captain Nemo when the Nautilus was cruising in the waters of Crete. The end of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. A Vanished Continent. The next morning, February 19th, I saw the Canadian enter my room. I expected this visit. He looked very disappointed. "Well, sir," said he. "Well, Ned, fortune was against us yesterday." "Yes. That captain must needs stop exactly at the hour we intended leaving his vessel." "Yes, Ned. He had business at his banker's." "His banker's?" "Or rather, his banking house. By that I mean the ocean, where his riches are safer than in the chests of the state." I then related to the Canadian the incidents of the preceding night, hoping to bring him back to the idea of not abandoning the captain. But my recital had no other result than an energetically expressed regret from Ned that he had not been able to take a walk on the battlefield of Vigo on his own account. "However," said he, "all is not ended. It is only a blow of the harpoon lost. Another time we must succeed, and tonight, if necessary." "In what direction is the Nautilus going?" I asked. "I do not know," replied Ned. "Well, at noon we shall see the point." The Canadian returned to Conseil. As soon as I was dressed, I went into the saloon. The compass was not reassuring. The course of the Nautilus was south-southwest. We were turning our backs on Europe. I waited with some impatience till the ship's place was pricked on the chart. At about 11:30, the reservoirs were emptied, and our vessel rose to the surface of the ocean. I rushed toward the platform. Ned Land had preceded me. No more land in sight. Nothing but an immense sea. Some sails on the horizon, doubtless those going to San Roque in search of favorable winds for doubling the Cape of Good Hope. The weather was cloudy. A gale of wind was preparing. Ned raved and tried to pierce the cloudy horizon. He still hoped that behind all that fog stretched the land he so longed for. At noon the sun showed itself for an instant. The second profited by this brightness to take its height. Then, the sea becoming more billowy, we descended, and the panel closed. An hour after, upon consulting the chart, I saw the position of the Nautilus was marked at 16 degrees 17 minutes longitude and 32 degrees 22 minutes latitude, at 150 leagues from the nearest coast. There was no means of flight, and I leave you to imagine the rage of the Canadian when I informed him of our situation. For myself, I was not particularly sorry. I felt lightened of the load which had oppressed me, and was able to return with some degree of calmness to my accustomed work. That night, about 11 o'clock, I received a most unexpected visit from Captain Nemo. He asked me very graciously if I felt fatigued from my watch of the preceding night. I answered in the negative. "Then, Monsieur Aronnax, I propose a curious excursion." "Propose, Captain." "You have hitherto only visited the submarine depths by daylight, under the brightness of the sun. Would it suit you to see them in the darkness of the night?" "Most willingly." "I warn you, the way will be tiring. We shall have far to walk, and must climb a mountain. The roads are not well kept." "What you say, Captain, only heightens my curiosity. I am ready to follow you. Come then, sir, we will put on our diving dresses. Arrived at the robing room, I saw that neither of my companions nor any of the ship's crew were to follow us on this excursion. Captain Nemo had not even proposed my taking with me either Ned or Conseil. In a few moments we had put on our diving dresses. They placed on our backs the reservoirs, abundantly filled with air, but no electric lamps were prepared. I called the captain's attention to the fact. "They will be useless," he replied. I thought I had not heard aright, but I could not repeat my observation, for the captain's head had already disappeared in its metal case. I finished harnessing myself. I felt them put an iron-pointed stick into my hand, and some minutes later, after going through the usual form, we set foot on the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of 150 fathoms. Midnight was near. The waters were profoundly dark, but Captain Nemo pointed out in the distance a reddish spot, a sort of large light shining brilliantly about 2 miles from the Nautilus. What this fire might be, what could feed it, why and how it lit up the liquid mass, I could not say. In any case, it did light our way. Vaguely, it is true, but I soon accustomed myself to the peculiar darkness, and I understood under such circumstances the uselessness of the Ruhmkorff apparatus. As we advanced, I heard a kind of pattering above my head, the noise redoubling, sometimes producing a continual shower. I soon understood the cause. It was rain falling violently and crisping the surface of the waves. Instinctively, the thought flashed across my mind that I should be wet through. By the water, in the midst of the water. I could not help laughing at the odd idea. But indeed, in the thick diving dress, the liquid element is no longer felt, and one only seems to be in an atmosphere somewhat denser than the terrestrial atmosphere. Nothing more. After half an hour's walk, the soil became stony. Medusae, microscopic crustacea, and penitules lit it slightly with their phosphorescent gleam. I caught a glimpse of pieces of stone covered with millions of zoophytes and masses of seaweed. My feet often slipped upon this sticky carpet of seaweed, and without my iron-tipped stick, I should have fallen more than once. In turning around, I could still see the whitish lantern of the Nautilus beginning to pale in the distance. But the rosy light which guided us increased and lit up the horizon. The presence of this fire under water puzzled me in the highest degree. Was I going toward a natural phenomenon as yet unknown to the savants of the earth? Or even, for this thought crossed my brain, had the hand of man aught to do with its conflagration? Had he fanned this flame? Was I to meet these depths companions and friends of Captain Nemo, whom he was going to visit, and who, like him, led this strange existence? Or did I find down there a whole colony of exiles, who, weary of the miseries of this earth, had sought and found independence in the deep ocean? All these foolish and unreasonable ideas pursued me, and in this condition of mind, overexcited by the succession of wonders continually passing before my eyes, I should not have been surprised to meet at the bottom of the sea one of those submarine towns of which Captain Nemo dreamed. Our road grew lighter and lighter. The white glimmer came in rays from the summit of a mountain about 800 feet high. But what I saw was simply a reflection developed by the clearness of the waters. The source of this inexplicable light was a fire on the opposite side of the mountain. In the midst of this stony maze furrowing the bottom of the Atlantic, Captain Nemo advanced without hesitation. He knew this dreary road. Doubtless he had often traveled over it and could not lose himself. I followed him with unshaken confidence. He seemed to me like a genie of the sea, and as he walked before me I could not help admiring his stature, which was outlined in black on the luminous horizon. It was 1 in the morning when we arrived at the first slopes of the mountain, but to gain access to them we must venture through the difficult paths of a vast copse. Yes, a copse of dead trees, without leaves, without sap, trees petrified by the action of the water and here and there overtopped by gigantic pines. It was like a coal pit, still standing, holding by the roots of the broken soil, and whose branches, like fine black paper cuttings, showed distinctly on the watery ceiling. Picture to yourself a forest in the hearts hanging onto the sides of the mountain, but a forest swallowed up. The paths were encumbered with seaweed and fucus, between which groveled a whole world of crustacea. I went along, climbing the rocks, striding over extended trunks, breaking the sea bindweed which hung from one tree to the other, and frightening the fish which flew from branch to branch. Pressing onward, I felt no fatigue. I followed my guide, who was never tired. What a spectacle! How can I express it? How paint the aspect of those woods and rocks in this medium, their underparts dark and wild, the upper colored with red tints? By that light which the reflecting powers of the water doubled, we climbed rocks which fell directly after with gigantic bounds and the low growling of an avalanche. To right and left ran long, dark galleries where sight was lost. Here opened vast glades which the hand of man seemed to have worked, and I sometimes asked myself if some inhabitant of these submarine regions would not suddenly appear before me. But Captain Nemo was still mounting. I could not stay behind. I followed boldly. My stick gave me good help. A false step would have been dangerous on the narrow passes sloping down to the sides of the gulf. But I walked with firm step, without feeling any giddiness. Now I jumped a crevice, the depth of which would have made me hesitate had it been among the glaciers on the land. Now I ventured on the unsteady trunk of a tree thrown across from one abyss to the other, without looking under my feet, having only eyes to admire the wild sights of this region. Their monumental rocks, leaning on their regularly cut bases, seemed to defy all laws of equilibrium. From between their stony knees, trees sprang like a jet under heavy pressure, and upheld others which upheld them. Natural towers, large scarps cut perpendicularly like a curtain, inclined at an angle which the laws of gravitation could never have tolerated in terrestrial regions. 2 hours after quitting the Nautilus, we had crossed the line of trees, and 100 feet above our heads rose the top of the mountain, which cast a shadow on the brilliant irradiation of the opposite slope. Some petrified shrubs ran fantastically here and there. Fish got up from under our feet like birds in the long grass. The massive rocks were rent with impenetrable fractures, deep grottos, and unfathomable holes, at the bottom of which formidable creatures might be heard moving. My blood curdled when I saw enormous antennae blocking my road, or some frightful claw closing with a noise in the shadow of some cavity. Millions of luminous spots shone brightly in the midst of the darkness. They were the eyes of giant crustacea, crouched in their holes, giant lobsters setting themselves up like halberdiers and moving their claws with the clicking sound of pincers, titanic crabs pointed like a gun on its carriage, and frightful-looking poulps interweaving their tentacles like a living nest of serpents. We had now arrived on the first platform, where other surprises awaited me. Before us lay some picturesque ruins, which betrayed the hand of man, and not that of the Creator. There were vast heaps of stone, among which might be traced the vague and shadowy forms of castles and temples, clothed with a world of blossoming zoophytes, and over which, instead of ivy, seaweed and fucus threw a thick vegetable mantle. But what was this portion of the globe which had been swallowed by cataclysms? Who had placed those rocks and stones like cromlechs of prehistoric times? Where was I? Whither had Captain Nemo's fancy hurried me? I would fain have asked him. Not being able to, I stopped him. I seized his arm, but shaking his head and pointing to the highest point of the mountain, he seemed to say, come along, higher." I followed, and in a few minutes I had climbed to the top, which for a circle of 10 yards commanded the whole mass of rock. I looked down the side we had just climbed. The mountain did not rise more than 700 or 800 feet above the level of the plain, but on the opposite side it commanded from twice that height the depths of this part of the Atlantic. My eyes ranged far over a large space lit by a violent fulguration. In fact, the mountain was a volcano. At 50 feet above the peak, in the midst of a rain of stones and scoriae, a large crater was vomiting forth torrents of lava which fell in a cascade of fire into the bosom of the liquid mass. Thus situated, this volcano lit the lower plain like an immense torch, even to the extreme limits of the horizon. I said that the submarine crater threw up lava, but no flames. Flames require the oxygen of the air to feed upon and cannot be developed underwater. But streams of lava, having in themselves the principles of their incandescence, can attain a white heat, fight vigorously against the liquid element, and turn it to vapor by contact. Rapid currents bearing all these gases into fusion and torrents of lava slid to the bottom of the mountain like an eruption of Vesuvius on another Terra del Greco. There indeed, under my eyes, ruined, destroyed, lay a town, its roofs open to the sky, its temples fallen, its arches dislocated, its columns lying on the ground, from which one would still recognize the massive character of Tuscan architecture. Further on, some remains of a gigantic aqueduct, here the high base of an acropolis, with the floating outline of a Parthenon. There, traces of a quay, as if an ancient port had formerly abutted on the borders of the ocean, and disappeared with its merchant vessels and its war galleys. Farther on again, long lines of sunken walls and broad deserted streets, a perfect Pompeii, escaped beneath the waters. Such was the sight that Captain Nemo brought before my eyes. Where was I? Where was I? I must know at any cost. I tried to speak, but Captain Nemo stopped me by a gesture, and picking up a piece of chalkstone, advanced to a rock of black basalt, and traced one word: Atlantis. What a light shot through my mind. Atlantis! The Atlantis of Plato, that continent denied by Origen and Humboldt, who placed its disappearance among the legendary tales. I had it there now before my eyes, bearing upon it the unexceptionable testimony of its catastrophe. The region thus engulfed was beyond Europe, Asia, and Libya, beyond the columns of Hercules, where those powerful people, the Atlantides, lived, against whom the first wars of ancient Greeks were waged. Thus, led by the strangest destiny, I was treading underfoot the mountains of this continent, touching with my hand those ruins 1,000 generations old and contemporary with the geological epochs. I was walking on the very spot where the contemporaries of the first man had walked. While I was trying to fix in my mind every detail of this grand landscape, Captain Nemo remained motionless, as if petrified in mute ecstasy, leaning on a mossy stone. Was he dreaming of those generations long since disappeared? Was he asking them the secret of human destiny? Was it here that this strange man came to steep himself in historical recollections and live again this ancient life, he who wanted no modern one? What would I not have given to know his thoughts, to share them, to understand them? We remained for an hour at this place, contemplating the vast plains under the brightness of the lava, which was sometimes wonderfully intense. Rapid tremblings ran along the mountain caused by internal bubblings. Deep noise, distinctly transmitted through the liquid medium, were echoed with majestic grandeur. At this moment the moon appeared through the mass of waters and threw her pale rays on the buried continent. It was but a gleam, but what an indescribable effect! The captain rose, cast one last look on the immense plain, and then bade me follow him. We descended the mountain rapidly, and the mineral forest once past, I saw the lantern of the Nautilus shining like a star. The captain walked straight to it, and we got on board as the first rays of light whitened the surface of the ocean. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Submarine Coal Mines. The next day, February 20th, I awoke very late. The fatigues of the previous night had prolonged my sleep until 11 o'clock. I dressed quickly and hastened to find the course the Nautilus was taking. The instruments showed it to be still toward the south with a speed of 20 miles an hour and a depth of 50 fathoms. The species of fish here did not differ much from those already noticed. There were rays of giant size, 5 yards long, and endowed with great muscular strength which enabled them to shoot above the waves. Sharks of many kinds, among others one 15 feet long with triangular sharp teeth and whose transparency rendered it almost invisible in the water. Among bony fish, Conseil noticed some about 3 yards long, armed at the upper jaw with a piercing sword, other bright-colored creatures known in the time of Aristotle by the name of the sea dragon, which are dangerous to capture on account of the spikes on their back. About 4 o'clock, the soil, generally composed of a thick mud mixed with petrified wood, changed by degrees and became more stony, and seemed strewn with conglomerate and pieces of basalt, with a sprinkling of lava. I thought that a mountainous region was succeeding the long plains, and accordingly, after a few evolutions of the Nautilus, I saw the southerly horizon blocked by a high wall which seemed to close all exit. Its summit evidently passed the level of the ocean. It must be a continent, or at least an island, one of the Canaries, or the Cape Verde Islands. The bearings not being yet taken, perhaps designedly, I was ignorant of our exact position. In any case, such a wall seemed to me to mark the limits of that Atlantis, of which we had in reality passed over only the smallest part. Much longer should I have remained at the window admiring the beauties of sea and sky, but the panels closed. At this moment the Nautilus arrived at the side of this high perpendicular wall. What it would do, I could not guess. I returned to my room. It no longer moved. I laid myself down with the full intention of waking after a few hours' sleep, but it was 8 o'clock the next day when I entered the saloon. I looked at the manometer. It told me that the Nautilus was floating on the surface of the ocean. Besides, I heard steps on the platform. I went to the panel. It was open, but instead of broad daylight as I expected, it was surrounded by profound darkness. Where were we? Was I mistaken? Was it still night? No, not a star was shining, and night has not that utter darkness. I knew not what to think when a voice near me said, "Is that you, Professor?" "Ah, Captain," I answered. "Where are we?" "Underground, sir." "Underground? And the Nautilus floating still?" "It always floats." "But I do not understand." "Wait a few minutes. Our lantern will be lit, and if you like light places, you will be satisfied." I stood on the platform and waited. The darkness was so complete that I could not even see Captain Nemo, but looking to the zenith, exactly above my head, I seemed to catch an undecided gleam, a kind of twilight filling a circular hole. At this instant the lantern was lit and its vividness dispelled the faint light. I closed my dazzled eyes for an instant, and then looked again. The Nautilus was stationary, floating near a mountain which formed a sort of quay. The lake then supporting it was a lake imprisoned by a circle of walls measuring 2 miles in diameter and 6 in circumference. Its level, the manometer showed, could only be the same as the outside level, for there must necessarily be a communication between the lake and the sea. The high partitions, leaning forward on their base, grew into a vaulted roof bearing the shape of an immense funnel turned upside down, the height being about 500 or 600 yards. At the summit was a circular orifice by which I had caught the slight gleam of light, evidently daylight. "Where are we?" I asked. "In the very heart of an extinct volcano, the interior of which has been invaded by the sea, after some great convulsion of the earth. While you were sleeping, Professor, the Nautilus penetrated this lagoon by a natural canal, which opens about 10 yards beneath the surface of the ocean. This is its harbor of refuge, a sure, commodious, and mysterious one, sheltered from all gales. Show me, if you can, on the coasts of any of your continents or islands, a road which can give such perfect refuge from all storms. Certainly, I replied, you are in safety here, Captain Nemo. Who could reach you in the heart of a volcano? But did I not see an opening at its summit? Yes, its crater, formerly filled with lava, vapor, and flames, and which now gives entrance to the life-giving air we breathe. But what is this volcanic mountain? It belongs to one of the numerous islands with which the sea is strewn. To vessels a simple sandbank, to us an immense cavern. Chance led me to discover it, and chance served me well. But of what use is this refuge, Captain? The Nautilus wants no port. No, sir, but it wants electricity to make it move, and the wherewithal to make the electricity, sodium to feed the elements, coal from which to get the sodium, and the coal mine to supply the coal. And exactly on this spot, the sea covers entire forests embedded in the geological periods, now mineralized and transformed into coal. For me, they are an inexhaustible mine. Your men follow the trade of miners here, then, Captain? Exactly so. These mines extend out of the waves like the mines of Newcastle. Here in their diving dresses, pickaxe and shovel in hand, my men extract the coal which I do not even ask from the mines of the earth. When I burn this combustible for the manufacture of sodium, the smoke escaping from the crater of the mountain gives it the appearance of a still active volcano. And we shall see your companions at work? No, not this time at least, for I am in a hurry to continue our submarine tour of the Earth, so I shall content myself with drawing from the reserve of sodium I already possess. The time for loading is one day only, and we continue our voyage. So if you wish to go over the cavern and make the round of the lagoon, you must take advantage of today, Monsieur Aronnax. I thanked the captain and went to look for my companions, who had not yet left their cabin. I invited them to follow me without saying where we were. They mounted the platform. Conseil, who was astonished at nothing, seemed to look upon it as quite natural that he should wake under a mountain after having fallen asleep under the waves. But Ned Land thought of nothing but finding whether the cavern had any exit. After breakfast, about 10 o'clock, he went down onto the mountain. Here we are, once more on land, said Conseil. I do not call this land, said the Canadian. And besides, we're not on it, but beneath it. Between the walls of the mountains and the waters of the lake lay a sandy shore which, at its greatest breadth, measured 500 feet. On this soil one might easily make the tour of the lake, but the base of the high partitions was stony ground, with volcanic locks and enormous pumice stones lying in picturesque heaps. All these detached masses, covered with enamel, polished by the action of the subterraneous fires, shone resplendent by the light of our electric lantern. The mica dust from the shore, rising under our feet, flew like a cloud of sparks. The bottom now rose sensibly, and we soon arrived at long circuitous slopes or inclined planes, which took us higher by degrees. But we were obliged to walk carefully among these conglomerates, bound by no cement, the feet slipping on the glassy crystal, feldspar, and quartz. The volcanic nature of this enormous excavation was confirmed on all sides, and I pointed it out to my companions. Picture to yourselves, said I, what this crater must have been when filled with boiling lava, and when the level of the incandescent liquid rose to the orifice of the mountain, as though melted on the top of a hot plate. I can picture it perfectly, said Conseil. But, sir, will you tell me why the great architect has suspended operations, and how it is that the furnace is replaced by the quiet waters of the lake? Most probably, Conseil, because some convulsion between the ocean produced the very opening which has served as a passage for the Nautilus. Then the waters of the Atlantic rushed into the interior of the mountain. There must have been a terrible struggle between the two elements, a struggle which ended in the victory of Neptune. But many ages have run out since then, and the submerged volcano is now a peaceable grotto. Very well, replied Ned Land. I accept the explanation, sir. But in our own interests, I regret that the opening of which you speak was not made above the level of the sea.
But friend Ned, said Conseil, if the passage had not been under the sea, the Nautilus could not have gone through it.
We continued ascending. The steps became more and more perpendicular and narrow. Deep excavations, which we were obliged to cross, cut them here and there. Sloping masses had to be turned. We slid upon our knees and crawled along, but Conseil's dexterity and the Canadian's strength surmounted all obstacles. At a height of about 31 feet, the nature of the ground changed without becoming more practicable. To the conglomerate and trachyte succeeded black basalt, the first dispread in layers full of bubbles, the latter forming regular prisms placed like a colonnade supporting the spring of the immense vault, an admirable specimen of natural architecture. Between the blocks of basalt wound long streams of lava, long since grown cold, encrusted with bituminous rays, and in some places there were large carpets of sulfur. A more powerful light shone through the upper crater, shedding a vague glimmer over those volcanic depressions forever buried in the bosom of this extinguished mountain. But our upward march was soon stopped at a height of about 250 feet by impassable obstacles. There was a complete vaulted arch overhanging us, and our ascent was changed to a circular walk. At the last change, vegetable life began to struggle with the mineral. Some shrubs and even some trees grew from the fractures of the walls. I recognized some euphorbias with the caustic sugar coming from them. Heliotropes, quite incapable of justifying their name, sadly drooped their clusters of flower, both their color and perfume half gone. Here and there some chrysanthemums grew timidly at the foot of an aloe with long, sickly-looking leaves, but between the streams of lava I saw some little violets still slightly perfumed, and I admit that I smelt them with delight. Perfume is the soul of the flower, and sea flowers have no soul. We had arrived at the foot of some sturdy dragon trees, which had pushed aside the rocks with their strong roots, when Ned exclaimed,
"Ah, sir, a hive! A hive!"
"A hive?" I replied, with a gesture of incredulity. "Yes, a hive," repeated the Canadian, "and bees humming around it." I approached, and was bound to believe my own eyes. There, at a hole bored in one of the dragon trees, were some thousands of these ingenious insects, so common in all the Canaries, and whose produce is so much esteemed. Naturally enough, the Canadian wished to gather the honey, and I could not well oppose his wish. A quantity of dry leaves mixed with sulfur he lit with a spark from his flint, and he began to smoke out the bees. The humming ceased by degrees, and the hive eventually yielded several pounds of the sweetest honey, which Ned Land filled with his haversack. "When I have mixed this honey with a taste of the artocarpus," said he, "I shall be able to offer you a succulent cake."
"Upon my word," said Conseil, "it will be gingerbread."
"Never mind the gingerbread," said I. "Let us continue our interesting walk." At every turn of the path we were following, the lake appeared in all its length and breadth. The lantern lit up the whole of its peaceable surface, which knew neither ripple nor wave. The Nautilus remained perfectly immovable on the platform and on the mountain. The ship's crew were working like black shadows clearly carved against the luminous atmosphere. We were now going around the highest crest of the first layers of rock which upheld the roof. I then saw that bees were not the only representatives of the animal kingdom in the interior of this volcano. Birds of prey hovered here and there in the shadows, or fled from their nests on the top of rocks. There were sparrowhawks with white breasts, and kestrels, and down the slope scampered with their long legs several fine, fat bustards. I leave anyone to imagine the covetousness of the Canadian at the sight of this savory game, and whether he did not regret having no gun. But he did his best to replace the lead by stones, and after several fruitless attempts, he succeeded in wounding a magnificent bird. To say that he risked his life 20 times before reaching it is but the truth, but he managed so well that the creature joined the honey kegs in his bag. We were now obliged to descend toward the shore, the crest becoming impracticable. Above us, the crater seemed to gape like the mouth of a well. From this place, the sky could be clearly seen, and clouds, dissipated by the west wind, leaving behind them even only the summit of the mountain, their misty remnants, certain proof that they were only moderately high, for the volcano did not rise more than 800 feet above the level of the ocean. Half an hour after the Canadians' last exploit, we had regained the inner shores. Here, the floor was represented by large carpets of marine crystal, a little umbelliferous plant very good to pickle, which also bears the name of a pierced stone in sea fennel. Conseil gathered some bundles of it. As to the fauna, it might be counted by thousands of crustacea of all sorts: lobster, crab, spider crab, chameleon shrimp, and a large number of shells, rockfish, and limpets. 3/4 of an hour we had finished our circuitous walk and were on board. The crew had just finished loading the sodium, and the Nautilus could have left that instant. But Captain Nemo gave no order. Did he wish to wait until night and leave the submarine passage secretly? Perhaps so. Whatever it might be, the next day the Nautilus, having left its port, steered clear of all land and a few yards beneath the waves of the Atlantic. End of chapter 10. Quite the story so far. What will happen next to those aboard the Nautilus? Tune in next time and find out. And in the meantime, if you've enjoyed the story, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment if you would. It really helps us out. Good night.